Hey there folks, Kozzi here, and welcome to this continuation of the Introduction to Draft series for Pick 1, Pack 1. Previously we looked at developing our evaluation skills and spent the majority of our time looking at how to evaluate creatures. For this series, Draft 102, we're going to be looking at the rest of the cards, and for this particular part we're going to be looking at how to evaluate what I would argue are the second most important category of cards in the game. Removal. Why are removal cards so important? Well, it's basically because they're the most efficient way of dealing with your opponent's creatures, which are the deciding cards in Eternal. In any given matchup, we know that our opponent's probably going to have 2 or 3 very powerful creature cards that, if left unchecked, are probably going to win them the game. This is how we check them. We send them off the pitch and we can deal with them so we can focus on more important things like killing our opponent. Now, whenever I look at a removal card, I break it down into my 3 big philosophical categories, slightly different to the overarching ones, but again, just big concepts to help me start to refine the process. I want to ask myself, what are the conditions that are attached to this card? Where's the asterisk? Where's the fine print? In simpler terms, when are the times that I can and cannot play this card effectively? Because I don't want to be cutting down on my choices unnecessarily. Next up, I'm pretty sure you probably could all guess if you've watched many of my videos. It's something I go on about a lot, but it is important, is value. How much value can I expect to get out of this card? Can I shift it or shimmy it so that I can get more than just 1 for 1? And this is not only talking about the value as far as card for card, this is also talking about power and how much you've invested in it. And then finally, I want to know what the speed of the removal is. This is perhaps the easiest one to tease apart. It basically means, is this a fast spell or not? Am I obligated to play this on my turn? Or can I hold up power and play it on my opponent's turn? And in so doing, hopefully garner extra value, trip them up, make their life uncomfortable, the whole shebang. So removal, it's a pretty huge category of cards. There are a bunch of different styles of cards that all constitute removal. And so I want to just take a moment identifying these categories. I recognize that this might be a bit elementary for advanced drafters, but I think it's really important to go over for people who are new to the game. And so I just want to ask for your forbearance for a moment or two whilst we do this, and then we can get into the fun curly stuff. In general, what you really want from your removal is for it to be unconditional. Here's a great example in Deathstrike. It's probably the gold star standard in Eternal because it only has 3 words and every single one of those words is amazing. Kill a unit, full stop. No ifs and or buts. Doesn't matter how huge it is or how small, it's dead. It's exactly what you want to do. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we have conditional removal. And to be frank, this is what the vast majority of removal is in Eternal. So this isn't as though it's a bad thing. It's just a thing. There are criterion on our cards that we have to fulfill. Vanquish is still an exceptional card. Kill a unit with a power of 4 or more. To be frank, most of the cards I want to kill have power of 4 or more because they're the ones I'm scared of. So it's still fine, but there still is a condition, and that's important to note because it means that there'll be scenarios in the game where I can't play this card, where it's just going to sit in my hand and twiddle thumbs. And I want to make sure that I'm aware of that and cognizant of it so I can play around it. A subcategory of conditional removal is damage-based removal. Rather than saying kill a creature under this scenario, instead this says do this amount of damage. Torch, do 3 damage. In other words, if the creature has 3 health or less, you can kill it. Yeah, okay. There are ways that you can wrangle it so that you can get more value and kill slightly more powerful creatures, but we're going to go into that later on when I do a series on how to most effectively and efficiently use your removal in limited games. But for the time being, it's worth seeing do an amount of damage as killing a creature with the same amount of health. 2 categories exist for damage-based removal. We've already talked about the spells, and up on screen is the other one that's unique to Eternal, being relic weapons. Basically with these, whatever their power is on the left-hand side is how much damage you can do to a creature, and in so doing, kill it. And these actually seriously do define limited. They still have an element of surprise, and that's important. There's another type of removal card that I also feel is pretty unique to Eternal. It's basically those that can remove an element of a card, but the physical card remains. It's a bit like taking out the trash, but when you go back in, you can still smell it for a while until the fresh air comes in. Permafrost is an example. Cards that stun, cards that silence, these are all examples. Or indeed cards that turn creatures into frogs. They remove the aspect of the card that is most threatening to you, be it size, their ability to engage in combat, their stats, but it still leaves something behind. Stunned creatures can still recover and attack later on. Frogs, for whatever reason in the Eternal universe, as cute and as tiny as they are, somehow possess mystical power beyond their one strength to pick up the most massive of mauls and in so doing hit you for 5. They can become a problem. So it's worth remembering that even though these might look very efficient and quite powerful, there is a distinct downside with this type of removal. And then finally, the other category are bounce spells. What I mean by this is they're cards that return rather than remove. They return a creature to their opponent's hand, and they'll have to cast it again. And this is very useful for getting through in combat. It's great for tempo decks, but you've spent a whole card and you've not taken one of your opponents. You've just changed where the card is rather than removing it from the game. So there are things that you need to think through with this. All of this being said then, it raises a problem. What kind of vanilla test can I provide to give you guys a rule of thumb to help you out, particularly while starting out? It's not as easy as creatures. I can't just say for a 2 cost you want a 2/2, for a 3 cost you want a 3/3. And then when you guys get a draft, you look at your 3 drop and you go, well, hang on a sec, that's a bit below the curve. What do I get to make it worthwhile? Instead, rather than just having an up-down axis to shift on, removal's a lot more complex. And in contemplating this conundrum, I realized that every time I look at a new piece of removal, I have a map that gets laid out in my head, a matrix, if you will. And it has both an up-down axis as well as a left-right axis, which, whilst to a degree of simplification, definitely still helps a lot in working out where I place a piece of removal. And it looks something like this. On the up-down axis, I ask myself the question of how conditional is this removal? Indeed, you'll recognize that sentence from before. And then on the left or the right after that, I ask myself, well, how much value can I expect to get? And wherever the card sits on the matrix, that's then my assessment of how good or how bad it is. And generally, I want things going as close as possible as they can to the top right-hand corner. Let's look at a couple of examples. Deathstrike, I mentioned it was the gold star. Really, really great unconditional removal. There's no strings attached. It just kills your unit. So it would be going right up here on my top-down axis. It's not the end of the story, though. I want to know how much value I can get out of this card so I can really assess how good it is. So the first thing I want to do is look at how much it costs. It cost me 4 of my precious, precious power to cast this card. How often do I get that amount of power back in what I've killed? How often am I killing a 4, 5, or 6 drop to be getting value on my opponent? And the reality is, more often than not, I save this card in my hand for that very reason, to try and catch their expensive bomb and to really, really hit them where it hurts. Yeah. Occasionally, there'll be times when I have to kill a 2-drop. They're smashing face, I need to just stop them from attacking me and I won't get my full value and I'll make a bit of a loss. But more often than not, I'm making a decent amount of value on this card. On top of that, because this is a fast spell, so the speed is in the right category for me, I can often catch my opponent off guard. If they put a piece of equipment on their creature, I can possibly get a second card of value out of my Deathstrike, which definitely does pop its value up. Let's take a look at another one. Torch. Very different style of card. This one deals 3 damage. So as far as conditional, being unconditional or conditional, the reality is there's a lot of creatures that have more than 3 health. And so there's a bit of a condition attached. Yeah, I can work around it to try and help myself out, but this will only really explicitly kill relatively cheap creatures with a health of 3 or less. In its advantage, unlike say Vanquish, which just says kill the creature under these conditions, this also gives me the opportunity to burn my opponent's face. So this is never going to be a dead card. There'll be times where it's a bad card and I wish I'd drawn something else, but it's never a card that I couldn't use at all. So that definitely does help it out a bit. What makes Torch amazing though isn't so much its conditionality, it's actually its value. For the low cost of 1, I can use this spell. So if we think through it and think through the spectrum of possibilities, how often am I going to be losing value on this card? Perhaps I have to kill a sprite that's been fated in, maybe an echo creature or a creature that's copied itself, so I'm a little bit down card advantage. But the reality is the vast majority of the time I'm going to be killing 2, 3, 4 drops, or if I'm super lucky my opponent's played the Vara that only has 3 health and I'll be absolutely laughing at the amount of value I get. So this is a card that really creates and generates a huge amount of value in my advantage. And so even though there's it's not the best on condition, the value is more than enough to make up for it for me. It's another type of removal card that will hit many cards at once. I like to call them board wipes. Old school Magic players might call them wraths because the first board wipe in the game of Magic was called Wrath of God. But they're all very similar cards. This one is a damaged based wrath. So rather than just saying kill all creatures, which is an amazing card, this one does 2 damage to each unit. So it's worth noting that that includes my units. So there'll be a fair number of scenarios where I'll have creatures with only 2 health on the board, and I might not even want to play this card at all, because it will blow me out. But that being said, as far as value, if there's ever a card that has a chance to get a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 and kill several creatures, it's probably Lightning Storm. If you think through some very realistic turns, my opponent could play a 1-drop, I don't do anything, they play a 2-drop, I play a 2-drop of my own. Let's say that it's a creature with 3 health, and then they play a 3-drop that's a 3-2. Boy oh boy, is Lightning Storm going to make them hurt. And whilst that's a little bit on the high end of realism, I think it's fair to say that you'll generally get 2 creatures for this card. And what's more, it only costs 2. If I catch 2 2-drops, I've got 4 power worth of value for my 2 power worth of investment. Lightning Storm's a beautiful card. Now it's worth noting, none of these hit the very top right hand corner, but I think I'd be exceptionally happy to pick any of these early in a draft because of how close they are to the end of the value spectrum. Let's take a look at another one, the Last Word. This is a relic weapon that's unusual, and to be honest, I think a lot of newer drafters will incorrectly pick this straight away on the basis that it is rare. They'll see the orange dot and go, sweet, rare equals powerful, done. And yeah, this card does have some power to it, but we want to really analyze how much. So, as far as its conditional or unconditional nature, it's only got 1 power, which means it can only kill creatures with 1 health, which is quite conditional. Fortunately, I read the rest of the card and I realize it's got deadly and quick draw as well. And what that basically means is whatever creature it happens to attack, it will kill. So it's quite close to unconditional removal. Let's now think about the value spectrum, because currently this looks like a great card. The thing is, it cost me 9 to cast. And you need to ask yourself, how many times have you finished a game of Limited before you've even gotten to 9 power? And the answer is actually a fair amount of times. So the reality is, this is actually going to be sitting in my hand a lot of times and I'll never even have the chance to cast it because it's just too expensive. And that actually becomes a condition. But staying on value, how often am I going to kill a creature that has a cost of 9 or more? I think I can remember one time I've seen a creature with a cost of 9 or more. I think what's much more likely is I'll cast this, I'll kill 1 creature and my opponent with their 9 power will cast 2 creatures, a 4 and a 5 drop, and I'll feel terrible. And so I think that there's just too much of a risk of a loss for me to really like the Last Word. Here's one for you guys to take a look at. Mithril Mace. It's another relic weapon. It costs 5. It has 3 power and 4 health. Where would you put this on the matrix? How would you rate its conditionality and its value? For me, 5 is at about the limit that I'm willing to pay for a piece of removal, because I'm never really expecting to get creatures that cost 5 or more with it, pieces of removal. Particularly so with this mace, because it's not unconditional. It's got 3 power. And there are a lot of creatures that cost 5 or more that have 4 or more health. So this is becoming quite a conditional card for me that represents a decent chance that I could make a loss. This being said, the important extra element to this card is that it gives you 4 health, which has a reasonable chance of you being able to kill 2 cards with it. If you think about it in the late phase of the game, going back to our quadrant theory, there's a good chance that my opponent top decks a creature, it's a 3/3, I top deck this, I kill their 3/3, and then they're forced either to play their other creature that they top deck next turn, or not play it at all. And this has done a great job for me. It's gotten quite a bit of value from the extra card. Alternatively, in these colors, it's not uncommon to see a board stall. And then behind the defense of my creatures, I could play my Mithril Mace and start to pick off some of their 3 health or less creatures, so I can start to create an overlap on my board. So there's a little bit of value we can expect to get here. It's not a lot, because it is conditional, but it's there. And so I think this will sit somewhere in the middle. It's one where, yeah, okay, I'd probably have one in my deck. I don't think I'll go out of my way. And that's because there's just too many asterisks attached to that particular card for me to be excited about it. One last one to consider, Predator's Instinct. Really interesting card, this one. As far as conditional, unconditional, it gives a unit killer, which means that I get to choose what I attack, I get to choose which defending creature I want to kill. Surely that's about as close as possible to unconditional removal as I can get, yeah? Problem is the first half of the sentence, give a unit. Thinking it through, that means that I can't use this card unless I have a unit on the table. If I'm in that endgame scenario where both of us have a blank board and I draw this card, I am so underwhelmed, because I've just drawn the worst card in my deck that doesn't do a single thing. If, however, I have some creatures on the table, it could represent a huge amount of value for me. I can use my 3/4 to attack into their 3/3 before it can use an unfortunate ability, and all for the low cost of 1 power. Seems like quite a decent value play. The problem is if my opponent happens to have bigger creatures than mine, I can't use Predator's Instinct at all. Or indeed, if we happen to have creatures that are the same size, I'm going to be 2-for-1ing myself and not making any kind of advantage. Yeah, some people will say, but hang on a sec, Kozzi, I'll just build around it. You know, time, it's Combray, it's Elysian colors, they generally have creatures that are above the curve, so I'll have a bigger creature and I can pretty much kill what I want. Problem with that is, if you have a bigger creature and you can kill what you want, you're probably winning the game anyway. And this card then won't turn around the game for you. It's not like a Death Strike that will suddenly get you back into a game that you're losing. In reality, this is a very tough card to analyze because it has such a huge spectrum. And this leads me into the last concept I'd like to explore with how to analyze the quality of removal. And it's this idea that every single card you'll ever see will have both a floor and a ceiling. What I mean by this is, with the floor of a card, you're basically asking what's its lowest point. When is it worth the least to you and not good at all? So in the case of Predator's Instinct, we already talked about it. If I top deck it and I have no creatures, this card is literally a blank card in my hand. It is so low that it is disgusting. The ceiling, however, is a different story. Looking at my Predator's Instinct, if I happen to be in a board parity state and I need to break something open, or if my opponent has a creature with an unusual ability that I just need to shut down, then this card can become amazing. And it's basically a phenomenal value play that for 1 cost I can get rid of whatever I want in the scenario, the ceiling, where I have the creature to help it out. And it's this spread between the ceiling and the floor that makes these cards quite tricky to analyze. And it actually makes it quite fun as well, because this is the space where you get to start to manipulate your drafts. But we'll be talking about that in the archetype series. If we compare this to a different card, a much less elastic card, let's take, for example, one of the strangers. The floor for a stranger is a 2-cost 2/2. The ceiling for a stranger is a 2-cost 2/2 that fixes up your power a little bit. There's not a lot of movement there. And so it's always important to think about the space or the flexibility between the floor and the ceiling of your cards. Oftentimes earlier in the draft, I'd rather pick cards with high ceiling. And later in the draft, I'm trying to fill it out and just make sure I can get consistency. How much I do that really also depends on my mood, which is probably one of my weaknesses as a drafter. But this concept then allows you to work out how context can shape a card a little bit more. Now watch out, there is a huge trap with this framework that I feel as though I need to tell you about. And the trap is this. Often people will look at a card, they'll undervalue the floor, they'll see the ceiling, and rather than looking at a realistic outcome for their ceiling, they're going to see the best scenario possible. Our players will look at Lightning Storm over here, and rather than just seeing, sweet, I get a 2-for-1 a lot of the time, occasionally I'll be able to change some combat maths, things like that. Instead, they'll go, check out the time when my opponent played 5 creatures that had health of 2 or less, and I got a 5-for-1 with this card. And they'll call that the ceiling, expecting it to happen 20, 30, 40% of the time, when in reality it only happens 0.5%. This is when I like to say that these players have entered magical Christmas land. Basically, the ceiling that they're engaging with is not realistic at all. It is the exceptionally rare scenarios, and they're seeing it as too common. And what it means is they over-evaluate cards that have an amazing ceiling, but generally only work somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd floor. Paladin's Oathbook is a great example of that. The 2-cost relic, excuse me, the 2-cost relic that when you attack gives your creature +1/+1, and people are like, oh, sweet, I get my creatures out, I start attacking, they get big, they get too big to block, my opponent can't do a thing, they kill it, they use their best piece of removal that was on a 2-drop, and I keep attacking with my next creature. And in this magical Christmas land, all they can think about is the time that they're ahead and on the play. What happens on the time when they don't draw it in the opening hand and you're in that top deck scenario? What happens when you're against that amazingly aggressive Stone Scar deck that's just attacking you and attacking you and attacking you, and you need to defend? And rather than playing a creature, you have to play this card. And you're never going to get value out of it until you turn that corner and start to attack, which you're probably not going to do because you couldn't play a creature. It's important to remember that something that sounds too good to be true probably is, and we want to look at the ceiling, but not the magical Christmas land. And if you happen to have a couple too many, when this happens and this happens and this happens, that's probably a sign that there's some bells jingling behind you and a dude who's slightly overweight in a red suit who wants to have a bit of a word. Eagle-eye viewers will notice that the background to my matrix was rock, paper, scissors. The reason why is because I want to talk about a slightly unique element of Eternal, and that is this idea that we have very conditional removal, and a lot of the creatures have also been designed to get around some of these conditions, and so it creates this unusual rock, scissor, paper dynamic. Take, for example, Annihilate. Kill a unit with a single faction, great card. There are so many cards with a single faction that you want dead. So many bombs. In fact, the vast majority of bombs that I get scared of are single factions. It's fast, it's cheap, but Eternal has built cards that it can't kill. There are multicolored cards in this game, and it's worth being aware that Annihilate has those limitations, so you can think through it in your assessment, and even more importantly, think through it in your play. Strangers also have no color. I didn't realize this until I couldn't annihilate one that had 2 pieces of equipment on it. And so this is built around to make your life a little bit tricky, and you need to keep it in mind. Execute, kill an exhausted enemy and deal 2 damage to the player. Sweet upside. Sweet card. Not so sweet when you're playing against Combre. Combre is the colour that has a lot of endurance units, and endurance units can't get exhausted, which also means they can't get stunned. And that's worth knowing. Granted, there's one scenario where you can exhaust an endurance unit. I talk about it in one of my introspectives, so feel free to check it out. But even worse when you're up against a Combre player is when they can pop it off because they play an equipment to give a creature that didn't have endurance. Again, scissor, paper, rock that you want to keep in mind. Indeed, even Mighty Death Strike has a foil. Don't know if you guys can think of it off the top of your head, but this is one of the keywords on a card that I really love because I think they've done a great job of balancing it and making life tricky. Aegis. You need to pop the Aegis first before you can access the creature. And it's worth noting that the paper in this scenario would actually be a relic weapon because it can attack in and still do combat damage. And this does inform the spectrum that you look at some of these cards. Spirit Drain, not a massive fan of. 6 is too expensive for me. 4 doesn't kill enough creatures. Yes, they put in some juicy targets to encourage you to roast chestnuts and to mull wine and all of those kind of things that keep you hanging around with Frosty for a bit too long. But there are just too many cards that it does nothing against for me to be super interested unless I'm pretty desperate. So there you have it, folks. How to evaluate removal. I think it comes down to that matrix of looking at what value you can expect and looking at the conditions with which you can expect to play the card. Another way of saying it is to look at the floor and the ceiling of the card and try and have reasonable expectations of both. If you can do this coupled with evaluating your creatures well, you're going to have a very solid deck no matter what. And I hope that this video has been helpful for you. In the next video, we're going to be looking into evaluating combat tricks and equipment, basically the remainder of the cards. And then we're going to be looking at how to make the most of our understanding of floor and ceilings, or contextual card analysis. I've been Kozzi making this video for Pick 1 Pack 1. Thank you for watching, and also thank you for your feedback, both the compliments, the stories of your improvement, and also the constructive criticism. I can't tell you how encouraging it's been for me to read these things, and yeah, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I'm really grateful for it, and it's what helps me persevere even when my throat's dying like this. So, I look forward to having a buttermenthol. I look forward to seeing you in future videos. As always, guys, have a good one.